I found it absolutely amazing in preparation for this talk, and it's been quite a long time in the making, but I found it amazing. And I find this quite often that subliminally you must sort of absorb what's going on around you, in terms of research and in terms of other people's interests, because there's been an absolute proliferation of interest and exhibitions and lectures and seminars about blue paper. And it's wonderful when you have the same idea as everybody else, around you, and it's really quite gratifying. And there's been, as I say, several exhibitions, and a lot of the research that I've done is through the wonderful Drawing on Blue uh, exhibition and book and whole seminar series at the Getty in the first quarter of this year in 2024. And then I had huge pleasure of going to the Drawn to Blue exhibition at the Courtauld with Hannah and Claire fairly recently, which I would absolutely highly recommend. It's a small absolute chocolate box, jewel box of an exhibition at the Courtauld, and that's on until January. So do hurry along there if you can and catch it before it closes. But if you're unable to get to London, the art collection at the University of Reading has this small but really very extremely beautiful object, which is our jumping off point for this exploration of all things blue paper. And this exploration goes way beyond pictorial art, but we'll start with the sublime most definitely, and this wonderful, wonderful work by Jacopo Zanguidi, more familiarly called Bertoia. And it's executed in ink media, in pencil, and in red chalk on both the recto and the verso, which you can see in my next slide here. Let me see if I can progress my slides. Yes, I can. So you can see that it's this beautiful double-sided art object, absolutely glorious. And it has this incredible, magnificent seated male nude on the recto. And to be honest, his sort of bovine equivalent in red chalk on the verso, along with various other studies. So Bertoia was born in Parma in Italy in 1544, and with fairly sort of short sojourns in Rome. He died there in 1574. He's very much a Parmese artist. He was very strongly influenced in his style by Francesco Mazzola, who was also known as Parmigianino, who was an extremely famous and leading painter in Parma in the early decades of the 16th century, and was very much a key proponent of this incredibly powerful and quite modern and odd post-Renaissance mannerist style of painting. And Bertoia very, very much subscribed to this style of artistic works, like his great master. And just like Parmigianino, Bertoia was very much a prolific fresco painter. And these, I think, to be honest, I've trawled to see if I can find the frescoes from onto which these were transposed. I failed so far, but I think a little bit more digging around will do the job. And they're likely to be studies for his fresco work, I suspect. So Sidney Freeburg, writing in the hugely encyclopedic Painting in Italy, 1500 to 1600. What an incredible, to fit it into a small paperback must have taken Sidney Freeburg quite a job. And he says of Bertoia, this quote here, which is, Bertoia chose to turn himself into a posthumous alter ego of Parmigianino. He could at will assume Francesco's style as if it were a native skin, infusing it immediately with creative life. I think that if anybody wrote that about me in terms of my output, I'd be extremely pleased. I think that's a really lovely summation of this very vital work that you can see in front of you here. So, looking at the apotheosis, sorry, this slide is terribly fuzzy, I see in big form. Looking at the apotheosis of Bertoia's works as a fresco artist, you need to look no further than this magnificent fresco in the Palazzo del Giardino in Parma, which was once the Ducal Palace in Parma, and several of the public rooms in this magnificent Renaissance palace were adorned with incredibly detailed frescoes on all four walls and indeed on the ceiling in the case of this particular room. And these were created by a team of leading artists of the time, largely based in Parma, including Bertoia. And this is a fresco from the Sala de Baccio. Forgive my appalling Italian pronunciation. It translates as Room of the Kiss, which is what you can see going on here. And it was painted between 1570 and 1573, with scenes representing the myth of Mars and Venus and Cupid. And I think you can see Venus and Mars sharing a rather chaste kiss for Venus and Mars, I think. I can't imagine it was quite such a chaste relationship. But a notable artistic trope are these. You can't really see them in this fuzzy image, unfortunately, but these absolutely incredible transparent columns. They're the oddest thing, but it's extremely typical of mannerism. This perspective that's been distorted to create and adjusted into falsehood to create this incredible spatial and figurative grouping to fit what Bertoia's vision was for this scene. And it's highly representative of late Mannerist style. What is slightly less representative of late Mannerist style is the sort of overtone of slight voyeurism. There's a slight peeping Tom element to the viewer in this case because of these opaque columns. So other artists who typified the movement, the Mannerist movement, are very famous artists like Jacopo, Tintoretto, and El Greco. So that he was in a very interesting and progressive stable of artists. So just looking again at our glorious seated male nude on blue paper, we can see Bertoia's subscription to some of the other key tenets of this Mannerist style, this elongated body topped with a proportionately smaller head, a very focus on the bulk of a body. This sculptural form, I mean, look at those incredible rippling shoulders and this exaggerated dorsal and leg muscles. I mean, he's quite magnificent, really. And also this hugely sinuous and serpentine seating position. This is all very, very characteristic of the Mannerist style. But colour too was an essential part of Mannerism. Blue undertones in Mannerist paintings, in particular, provide this wonderful contrast, high contrast, and this, as you saw with the column painting, this incredible creation of perspective and shadow and form, all combining to produce this really naturally unnatural style. And I think this use of blue as an undertone for a lot of Mannerist paintings may well be significant to the adoption of blue paper as a substrate throughout the 15th and 16th century Italy by the Italian artists of the time, where white highlights, were used so effectively against the background colour to create this sense of perspective and depth and texture and form and contour. And this next painting is really quite magnificent. So look here, for example, at this painting by Tintoretto. It's a seated nude. It's a study of Michelangelo's Samson and the Philistines, and it's in the Uffizi in Florence. And although the pose is remarkably similar to that of our own Bertoia, the Tintoretto sketch has the added advantage of such a greater, such a higher level of textural and three-dimensional substance through the use of this white highlighting across the shoulders, and providing this with the blue paper substrate, this incredible contrast. You get this fantastically tactile sense of this hugely impressive back. And without getting too sort of corporeal about it, you can very much feel the heat from this skin and almost the glistening sweat of this figure poised to move and act, ready to spring, ready to move into another pose. And this off balance in the figures, in the structure of the figures in mannerism, is again very typical of the artistic movement. It's a figure of purpose. It's got definite motion, and in this case, quite strenuous movement. You can feel the tension in the muscles. And this too, to a possibly, if I'm being unfair, maybe to our present subject, but slightly less well defined in terms of the Bertoia, but definitely still has that atmosphere. It has that movement and sinuousness, I suppose. And also the slightly unnatural twisting of the body and the position of the legs again has a feeling as if there's turning here, there's a movement here that we are about to see. It brings the painting to life. So the colour blue was hugely significant and symbolic, held a very significant symbolic function throughout the history of color, really. And I think it really is particularly significant in Italian art, and arguably is the key color of the Renaissance. And it's always been associated with expense, luxury, wealth, and very much a color of nobility and preciousness. And blue artists' colours, famously lapis lazuli and its pigment ultramarine, these were incredibly expensive pigments, and with artists only using them for the most significant paintings and the most significant figures. And then often only as a top coat, it would be the finishing, the icing, the blue icing on the cake. In Renaissance Italy, nobody was more important than the Virgin Mary. So she became very closely associated from then on with this incredibly vivid blue colour, primarily due to the almost totemic use of this highly prized colour for use in the clothing of the Virgin Mary. It's an act of reverence almost. I don't think that's overdoing it too much. It's somebody offering up this beautiful, expensive colour as a form of worship, no doubt about it. And this Sassoferrato painting here of the Virgin in Prayer, 17th century painting of Virgin Mary by Giovanni Battista Salvi, more commonly known by his the name of his town, actually, in sort of central Italy, Sassoferrato, and it's held in the National Gallery. You can see it there. It really is. I can't think of a better epitome of the use of blue pigment for religious painting. It evokes huge amounts of purity and serenity and grandeur and power, and all attributes associated with the colour blue. Sassoferrato is often seen as depicting the personification of a virtue and a virtuous woman. As uncomfortable as that perhaps can be to our modern tastes, but not all people across Europe at the time had the same cultural connotations from the colour blue. I mean, if we go further back in the ancient world, of course, the love of blue varied hugely throughout ancient times, ancient civilizations. In Rome, it was the color of barbarism. They had no place in the rainbow for blue, for example. It didn't have they didn't include blue. The sea was dark wine red. It wasn't blue. They clearly didn't care for blue, associated with immorality and loose morals. Women with blue eyes, for example, were seen as suspect, which seems a little bit unfair to me. But uh, you know, if you contrast that with how blue was revered in ancient Egypt, and they liked the color so much that they introduced the first ever synthetic blue, which still bears the name Egyptian blue, which was a combination of silica, lime, and copper to create the characteristic turquoise we associate with the amulets and ceramics of the period, some of which, of course, you can see at the absolutely wonderful Ur Museum on the campus at White Nights. Plenty of beautiful, beautiful Egyptian blue objects there. So whilst the Italian Renaissance worshipped blue, in German-speaking countries, blue had, at the time of the Renaissance, had very negative connotations. It was seen as a colour of fraud, ignorance, deceit, and again, in terms of eye colour, cruelty. So I think you have the possibly Catholic and the Protestant view of the colour blue there. But enough of blue. Let's talk about our subject, the beautiful, beautiful blue paper. Let us have a little look at how it developed across Europe from the late 14th century onwards. So initially, the production of blue paper was centered very much on the northern area of mainland Italy, with the earliest reference to its manufacture coming from 1389, very early, in a book of statutes of the people of the commune of Bologna. And in this statute book, it was stated that fine quality royal paper was to be sold for 5 Bolognese libra per ream, with royal blue being sold at 4 libra per ream. So blue paper was definitely at the cheaper end of the market, no doubt about it. But the next point is very, very important. Analysis has shown that the blue colour came from a substance called indigotin, which is actually not to do with indigo. It's to do with the key. It's the key coloured component in the European woad plant, and is a more light-fast component than its close relative indigo. So woad was grown most purposefully as a dye crop, but also spontaneously as a weed all across medieval Italy, and was very much a mainstay of the medieval Italian economy when it came to colour production, with exports of woad dyed textiles in particular all across Europe. So it's likely that initially the blue paper stock was used in the main as wrapping paper, including for the better, at the time, more desirable white paper, as the colour contrast between the two, the contents and the wrapper, made the white sheets seem much, much brighter and more attractive when seen together. So it was a way of possibly making slightly imperfect white paper seem, the blue wrapper made with the white paper seem a lot more vivid and pure. So despite this early reference of blue paper being produced in Bologna, the manufacture of blue paper became very, very and very quickly focused around Venice, with all its associations to the trade of pigments from and dyestuffs from Asia. And the very outward-looking and trading nature of Venice enabled the use of blue paper to spread north, with the material being manufactured all across Europe by the end of the 17th century. So looking at the fibre makeup of the blue paper, when you look at it under microscopy, we see very much it being created from two distinct activities. The use of mixed coloured textiles, including those dyed with woad, and the addition of pigments such as indigotin to the dye bath to make a more uniform blue colour. So under analysis, true blue paper made from blue rags, blue clothing rags, from linen and hemp and possibly wool fibers, you know, were produced. This blue paper was produced using a fairly narrow color range of fiber sources, possibly anything between sort of pure blue and grey brown were used, separated out from the rags that were going to be used for white paper, and they were used for this production of the blue paper. I think they indicate the evidence that there was woolen textiles and sometimes quite a high quantity of woolen textiles and indeed other coloured fibres. Under microscopy, you can see a lot of red fibres, a lot of red woolen fibres. I think this really does indicate that the reuse of clothing was the prime source of these, or reuse of domestic textiles was the prime source of the fibres for this pulp. So these pulped fibres appeared blue, even though they were made up of grey and brown and all these other different colours. They appeared blue in appearance at a distance, at a viewing distance from the artwork. But on closer inspection, and you can see this very much in the Courtauld exhibition, on closer inspection, you see them as the paper sheet being flecked and variegated very much, with different base fibres that are being used in the pulp, reacting very differently in the pulping process in terms of the amount of colour that they retain. If you imagine the pulping process being really rather aggressive in terms of it mixing the pulp and breaking the pulp down, different fibres hold on to their colour in a way that other fibres don't. So in contrast, blued papers, which is what you see on your screen here, this is a painting from the late 17th century, produced by flooding the surface of the paper with an indigo wash to create this blue paper. These papers were produced in addition to, not instead of, in addition to the pure blue papers that I've just described. And I think that we also get a third grouping of papers which were produced at around about this time as well, where you add an additional colour, ingotin, several other blue pigments actually to the pulp in the pulping process, and these are known as vat dyed papers. So Irina Bruckel, a conservator who has studied the conservation of blue papers, states that the use of rags for white paper pulp often created a very unattractive yellow-brown tinge to the finished paper, and this use of a blue colorant was possibly initially intended to counteract that effect. Much like some washing powders now have additional blue sort of colorants in them to make the white look whiter rather than grey or brown as white items get washed more. So ingotin dye from woad and other pigments such as smalt, which is a cobalt glass, indigo itself, and logwood, which is a hardwood from Mexico, which gives a very purplish pink pigment from this tree bark, used very commonly in ink and indeed paper throughout history, were added to the dye bath at the pulping and beating stage of the process. It's thought that this adding of the colour to the dye bath was not used quite so much by Italian paper makers, where they were using the blue rags and recycled textiles, but much more by Dutch paper makers in the 17th century, and was actually known as dyeing paper in the Dutch manner. So the widespread manufacture of blue paper in the Netherlands is also very much linked to the invention of the Hollander beater in the late 17th century. So the Hollander beater was a major step change in terms of paper production, allowing a much higher volume of pulp to be produced. And instead of using wooden stampers to crush the fibre, which is what happened in the early period of paper production, they would use a rotating drum covered in sort of blunt blades to chop and create a finer dye stuff, allowing the pulp to accept the blue dye that was being added at that stage to get a much more uniform sheet than the variegated, more sort of speckled effect that you get with pure rag pulp made from blue textiles. So, as so often happens in paper manufacture throughout certainly the printing period from the 1450s through to modern day, really, as so often happens. Demand increased and the means of processing the colorants used in the production of these blue papers was adjusted to make use of more economic rather than necessarily stable processes in producing these blue papers. In the early 18th century, for example, the use of sulfuric acid was introduced into the processing of indigo to produce a quicker result. And this would have been introduced into the pulp to create these blue papers, creating effectively a chemically degraded product before it left the paper mill. And this acidity was reduced often by the use of a heavy alkali like lime or chalk, and this too introduced a level of residue and speckling in the paper from this later period of blue paper production, resulting in an effect certainly in the appearance and possibly the stability of the paper itself. So looking also at not just pictorial art, here's something that's extremely close to my heart, the output of Aldus Manutius, his printing press in the early 1500s, late 1400s and early 1500s. So it's definitely not only works of art that employed the effect, the impact of blue paper, and here we have this special use of blue paper in text blocks. This is a copy of the key Renaissance printer, humanist printer Aldus Manutius' Libri de Rustica, printed in 1514, and here you can see Manutius's extremely characteristic anchor and dolphin device. And Thea Burns, who has done a lot of study of blue paper in the 15th and 16th century, suggests that these were very much presentation copies, high luxury, high-end objects used as patron gifting or certainly as promotional materials for the printing press of Aldus Manutius. And these were not cheap materials used cheaply. Other examples of books printed on blue paper show extremely high quality paper fibers made from very carefully graded and selected blue rags. And Burns goes on to say that incompletely separated thread twists, fiber clumps, and large shives, this is the evidence of raw materials in form of unbeaten non-paper fibers like husks and stalks, and other coarseness from the paper fibers themselves, from the base fiber itself, are extremely rare in this paper. So this was really high quality stuff. It definitely wasn't cheap wrapping paper, cheap paper used, say, for example, they used to wrap sugar in paper, hence sugar paper. This is not cheap material. This is extremely high-end, valuable, showy use of blue paper. So I'd like to jump forward now to the use of blue paper in archival collections, and the huge predominance of blue substrates for legal documents in particular, and Victorian forms, very much. You can see here, this is a inquest file from the University of Birmingham archive relating to a civic event. So very much an official, a substrate used by officialdom. Blue paper as an attractive, high contrast substrate had its own renaissance at this time, with very heavily sized, extremely heavily calendared. That means when the paper is hot pressed through rollers to give this very smooth and almost glossy finish. These were extremely common in the later years, the second half of the 19th century. And it seemed to be very much a stationary tradition, very much a stationary standard. And like its Dutch forebears, this paper may well have been coloured to disguise poor quality or unattractively muddy fibre base. And Irina Bruckel again states that the colours used to create these papers, these more modern papers, may have included Prussian blue, indigo, smalt, or in particular a late 19th century interpolation, the creation of synthetic ultramarine, not the expensive lapis lazuli that we saw in the beautiful Italian papers, but a synthetic color based on sulfur-containing compounds. So now that we've introduced sulfur into the mix, I think it's time to talk a little bit about some conservation. This potentially acidic base in terms of the late 19th century papers will become apparent in a moment. So here we have some of the key risk factors when managing the extended term stability of these blue papers. As you can see from this Domenico Tintoretto drawing, the recto of the paper on which it's taken the display, the exposure load of this particular drawing has severely faded to a rather dull brown yellowy color, whereas the verso, excluded from the light in its mount, maintains its blue color beautifully. This is one of the objects on display where you can see both the recto and the verso of the sketch, the drawing at the Courtauld. It's absolutely magnificent to see. And so looking at the pigments, indigotin, indigo, logwood, these are all highly susceptible to deterioration in light, which is a bit of a problem for pictorial art, where you need light to be able to see these things. And so all blue papers must absolutely be considered to be highly light sensitive. Not so much the media, although the media of course can be, but certainly the substrate. That's what we're looking at here. The impact of the environment on the storage environment and the display environment on blue paper should also be considered in combination, particularly with archive items, in combination with acidity from media such as iron-containing inks, such as iron gall ink, the most common media throughout from the sort of 1200s all the way through to the late 1800s. So these acidic inks, mold excreta, as can be seen here in this legal document with on the lower right of the screen, which is got mold residues and this sort of blotchy discoloration in contrast with the blue substrate. this is very much a excreted from the mold, but also the effects probably of pollution from fossil burning fuel in the period of its use during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And in the presence of high humidity, this can absolutely kickstart and start to migrate these acidic components into the paper itself and cause, as you can see here, this localized bleaching and the degradation of both the color and the structure of the blue paper. The white haloing that you see here is also often seen around media lines, very much in particular around iron gall inclines, this localized bleaching caused by the movement through humidity of the inks. And it's quite devastating for these archival documents in particular. So I don't want to end on a depressing note, so I'm going to go back to our beautiful, lovely Bertoia sketches that the University of Reading holds. So these really are quite beautiful early examples of blue paper use in art, and they both charm and challenge us, I feel. They have they're quite perplexing often, I find, these sketches on blue paper. The use of the substrate to form part of the overall impact of the work is quite remarkable and not what we're used to seeing in pictorial art. We don't see the substrate necessarily as being part of the picture, but in this case, it most certainly is. And to me, they add a distinct layer of obscurity and mystery that would be totally lost on a white ground. I would love to see what these looked like on a white background, and they would be very, very different in terms of their use of light and shade and the three-dimensionality that these objects very much have because of the contrast with the blue. It gives a subtlety that is extremely charming. So whether this was intentional by Bertoia, whether he was intending to use this blue paper, we'll never, for this purpose, for this effect purpose, we'll never know. He could have, was he using the cheaper material, the four libra per ream, just out of expedience, out of the fact it was a sketch, it was a temporary thing, it was something ephemeral, he never meant to have any longevity, or certainly not for us to be worshipping it today. Or was this effect intentional? Was he meaning to create this this depth and this contrast and this rather mannerist style of sketching out his possible frescoes? We'll never know. What would be really interesting is to do further fibre analysis and look and see what category of paper this blue paper falls into that Bertoia has used here. And then maybe we can start to formulate a little bit more, develop the hypothesis that I've proposed. But in terms of an arresting and curious work of art, I am very grateful to him, regardless of the original intent, for his use of blue paper for this object. Thank you.